Hello, my name is Dawn Nall, and I'm here with my colleague James Markham, as well as the director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, Heather Himmelberger. During this webinar, we'll be walking you through the AWWA Water Audit Software version 5. A little bit about who we are and who we're with. We are the Southwest Environmental Finance Center, which is a part of the Center for the Water and Environment, which is part of the School of Engineering, which is part of the University of New Mexico. We do work with the state of Tennessee to offer training throughout the state in water loss auditing. And we do work throughout the country with water systems and wastewater systems, doing work with asset management, water loss, energy management, water system resiliency, a whole variety of topics. We have pictures of the three of us here so you can get familiar with who we are. And we have been around for over 20 years now, and we are part of a larger network of EFCs that exist around the country. So that's a little bit about who we are. Now let's get into the discussion that we're focused on today. So this AWWA water audit is required by the state of Tennessee's Comptroller's Office for you to submit anytime you submit your financial statements. And so the purpose of this webinar is to help you understand the audit, what the inputs are, and what the outcomes are for the AWWA software. So the water audit software itself is an industry standard software, and it is based on an international standard. It does work for systems of all sizes. The outputs can be a little bit different depending on how big or small you are. But it does work for all size systems. And when you take a look at the software, the cells that are highlighted in yellow are the cells that are calculated for you. And then the cells that are in white are the areas where you would have to enter data. But for every system, the amount of data that you have to enter can vary. Not every system enters data into every white box. So it is it looks kind of busy and complicated, but it is pretty straightforward once you understand what is being asked of you, which is what we will explain to you today. And it is Excel based, so it does feel familiar to most people, and it does work the way that you would expect Excel to work. So when you're looking at the white cells, there are 5 different data categories where you will be inputting data. And those categories are the water that is supplied to your system, and then the water that you supply to your customers. It asks you some questions about system characteristics, about your financial information, and then a tad bit of other information. And Heather's going to talk about those 5 categories more in depth here in just a few minutes. When you finish your data inputs, the software takes those volumes that you put into the spreadsheet and it calculates your non-revenue water. So non-revenue water does include the water that is lost or leaking like you see in the picture here, but it also includes things like the water that you're giving away. So we want you to take the time to understand what the audit's calculating. We think it's worthwhile for you to have a good understanding of what the outcomes of the audit are. When you're getting started with the audit, you have to set some parameters. You have to decide what the audit's going to include. And one of the parameters that you have to decide upon is the time frame of the audit. So the audit should run for a period of 1 year. So you should have data for 1 full year. And then you can decide if you want that full year to be a calendar year or if you want it to be the fiscal year. So it's worth putting some time into and some thought into up front. Have a discussion with your team about what limits you want to use for the time frame. If you're switching from one time frame to another, from 1 year to the next, you lose data or you overlap data in that year that you're switching. So then you can't compare from year to year, so it can be problematic. It's best to pick one and stick with it. Another parameter that you need to decide upon is the boundaries of your audit. So for some systems, this is a pretty easy thing to determine, and for others, it can be a little bit more complex. So we want you to think about your audit boundaries. So for example, if you have a well that is used, let's say, exclusively for irrigation, you probably wouldn't want to include it in your audit. But if that water did pass through your treatment plant for some reason, then you would probably need to include it in your audit. So you want to think carefully about your water sources and your points of use, and clearly define where the audit starts and where the audit stops. And if you have any questions about what your audit boundaries should be, we would love to talk to you about that. So give us a call, contact one of us, email us at the Southwest EFC, and we'll be happy to help answer those questions. Finally, you'll want to look at the units that you use throughout the audit. So with the audit, there is a set of 3 choices, and you can pick either millions of gallons, megaliters, or acre feet. You can't choose to use gallons in one place and millions of gallons in another, or acre feet in one place and millions of gallons in another. You have to choose one and use it throughout the entire audit. If you're a smaller system and you don't record volumes in any of these units, you probably are recording your units in gallons or thousands of gallons. So in which case you can just convert from gallons to millions of gallons by just dividing by 1,000,000. So again, if you have any questions or concerns about what units to pick, how to be consistent with it, we would be happy to help work with you to determine that. We're going to take a little bit of time and look at the water balance. So the water balance is based on the concept of what goes in is what comes out. So let's take a look at what that means. So this water balance theory, based on this theory that, again, what goes in has to come out of the system, but where it comes out is not always the ideal location. So what goes in comes out somewhere. The audit also has takes a look at the idea of the fact that the water is either making you money, you're either getting paid for it, or you're not getting paid for it. So the water audit's looking at kind of 2 different problems. You have a blue problem and a green problem, where the blue is your water volume and your green is your revenue or your money. And the problems that they can generate is that your blue problem is caused by the water that's not going where we want it to go. And the green problems caused by money that we're not making, but that we could potentially be making. So because the water balance is about this idea that the amount of water entering the system must equal the amount leaving the system, we want you to understand what these ins and outs are and how they apply to the audit. So in the audit software, you have to provide the amount of water that enters the system. You tell it how much water enters your system. So your water can come from a couple of places. It can come from your own sources. So that would be your wells, your source water, or you can have water that enters the system that you import or that you purchase from another system. Or you can have a combination of those where you purchase some water and you produce some of your own water. These are considered your system inputs. Those system inputs can then go to one of a couple of places. So for most systems, the water that enters your system is delivered to your distribution system. It goes to your consumers. But for some systems, they may also have some export water. So that's the water that they would treat and then sell to another system or another purchaser. So this export water needs to be accounted for in your calculation, so it doesn't look like it's going to your water system. So it asks you if you export any water, and if so, how much. Then the rest of the water is going out of your system. So the outs look like your distribution system, and where is it going? So it's either going to make you money or it's not. So each system has water that makes them money and water that doesn't. The important thing here is that you understand how much and why. So the water that's making money is doing so by being billed to a customer. So this is your water that you're billing. You either have a meter or you don't have a meter, but either way, you're sending a customer a bill for using that water. And that is referred to as your revenue water. Then you have the water that's not making you money, and that's referred to as your non-revenue water. And that's broken into 3 categories in the audit. So you have what's called authorized unbilled usage, you have apparent losses, and you have real losses. So again, that's non-revenue water. If we take a look at those 3 categories, they're broken down even further. So we have that authorized unbilled usage. And this is where you're telling people that they can use the water, but that you're not going to bill them. And it can be for a wide variety of things. It can be for parks, it can be for city buildings, it can be for firefighting, it can be for flushing, it can be for a lot of things. So you have in this category authorized metered usage. So here you do have a meter in place, but you're not going to send them a bill. Then you have the opposite side where you do not have a meter in place, but you're still not going to send them a bill. That second category was apparent losses, and under apparent losses, we'll talk about we'll talk about unauthorized usage, which is theft. Someone's taking the water that's not supposed to be. It's not authorized, therefore it's theft. You also have customer meter inaccuracies. This is where no meter is perfect. And so if a meter is not reading 100% accurate, you're losing some volume of water or you're overreading some volume of water. So these losses are based on the fact that your meters are not perfect and you want to account for that or adjust for that inaccuracy. And the last category here in apparent losses is systematic data handling errors. Sometimes these are called paper errors. This is where you might have someone entering data and there's a typo, or you might have a meter that turns over and the software doesn't recognize a meter turnover accurately. So you have a negative flow, something of that kind of nature. So systematic data handling errors are also apparent losses. And then our third category was those real losses. This is leakage. This is actual leakage in your system, real loss. So this is where you have leakage on your mains, leakage on your service lines, or leakage or overflows at your tanks. So all of this is your non-revenue water. This is where your calculations will come into place and you will then have a value and a volume for your non-revenue water. So Heather's going to walk you through the audit software at this time.
Okay, so we're going to pick up with the water audit itself. And again, this is a potential starting point for your water loss control program. And I say potential starting point because there are other ways you can start with component analysis and some other things. But this is a logical place to begin your efforts in water loss control. So the water audit is a diagnostic tool that's going to help empower you to take action, because it's really the actions taken by the utility that can save water or generate you revenue or improve the amount of revenue you get. It's not the water audit itself that does that. It's the actions that you take out of the water audit. So the water audit will give you information about what's going on in your system, and then you need to take action to address the various areas in your system, which might be real or apparent losses, to either improve your revenue situation or reduce the amount of water you're losing. So the water audit is an American Water Works standard approach to categorizing or accounting for water. It helps provide information to prioritize your actions. So it can give you information about the value and volumes of water, which can lead you to say, well, I'd rather address this area over that area because it will have either more value or more volume. It can provide you metrics to examine your non-revenue water over time and provide overall volumes and value of water in different categories like we discussed before. So you can kind of use that information to help make decisions going forward. The water audit is not going to be completely accurate no matter how much work you put into it. So you can work as hard as you want, and there's always going to be errors in the water audit, and that's understood. What we're talking about is a very complex problem, and you have a lot of inputs and outputs in your system, and water is not able to be measured completely accurate all the time, and you have certain areas that are harder to measure than others. So don't beat yourself up about that. It's never going to be 100% accurate. You just want to make it as good as you can. It's not the only option to determine what actions you can take. There are other things you can do, like component analysis, and you can work in conjunction between the water audit and some of these other types of approaches. Bottoms up approach. The water audit is a top down approach to water audit, to water loss. So again, there's other ways to determine what actions to take besides just the water audit. And it doesn't discuss comprehensive benefits. It really only focuses on the dollars. So it's going to help you understand how much money you might be losing related to real water loss and apparent water loss, but it's not going to give you anything related to environmental or social benefits. So environmental benefits are those that affect the environment, like your water resources, and are you drawing from an aquifer that might be limited, or is there some reason to not want to take so much water from that aquifer? Social benefits relate to your customers. So does it affect your customers that you have a lot of breaks in the lines, or you see water going down the street? So it won't cover those types of benefits. It really only focuses on the financial benefits. And it will not allow you to separate out real water loss into its components. So there are three components of real water loss: the water that's leaking from mains, the water that's leaking from your service lines, and the water that's either overflows or leaks at storage tanks. It can't tell you anything about those three types of real water losses. It's only going to focus on um, giving you the full number for real water loss. So just keep that in mind as you go through. So if you understand the limitations of what the water audit is and what it is not, it can be a very useful part of an overall water loss control program to kind of give you that starting off point of where you want to go and understanding what's happening. So now we're going to talk about the audit software itself, and we're focusing on version 5 of the water audit software. We're going to talk about the components and the data categories. So again, the water audit is a way to account for all of your water. Back in the day, we used to call it unaccounted for water. And we would say, okay, we know this water got metered, everything else is unaccounted for. And that's not very helpful. So one of the reasons they developed the water audit was to give you a way to account for all the water and where it's going in your system, so that we no longer have to talk about unaccounted for water. The software has 12 components. So it looks a little intimidating, but we're only going to focus on 3 of them. A lot of these other components are to give you more information, to give you ideas of where to go. There's only 3 parts of the water audit that are actually data entry pieces to the water audit. So we're just going to focus on those 3 components. And then James is going to talk a little bit about the performance metrics that you get out of the water audit. So the data entry occurs in 3 places again. The first is the instruction sheet. On the instruction sheet, you're going to put information about your name, the utility name, the PWS ID number, that type of thing. And you also have to pick your volume reporting units that Dawn talked about earlier. If you don't pick these volume reporting units, which are either millions of gallons, megaliters, or acre feet, you're not going to be able to do the audit. It won't work. So that's one thing you have to do. You don't really have to put the name of the contact person or the utility. It will still work. It's just a really good idea if you do. You also want to put in the year of the audit. So what year is it covering? And is that a calendar year or a fiscal year? That's really important, because if you don't enter that information in there, you're not going to even know what dates the water audit covers. Next is the reporting worksheet, and this is going to be the thing we'll focus most on in this section. This is where you're going to enter the data that will actually calculate your water loss. And then finally, the other data entry screen is the comments section. The comments section doesn't actually affect the calculation of water loss or anything like that. It's there so that you can enter information about anything you want related to the data. So this is your chance to put right into the water audit how you calculated things, any um, assumptions that you made, where you got information. It's a really useful tool, and we highly recommend that as you go through the audit, you put information here, because you're not going to remember a year from now exactly how you did the calculations, or where you got the information, or who did it. Or if you're doing the water audit this year and somebody else is doing it next year, they're not going to necessarily know how you got the information you received. And if you have to make assumptions, which occurs from time to time, it's a good idea to put it in there. If you've chosen to use the default values, there's a couple cases in which you can. You might put a note as to why you use the default value instead of choosing to collect data on your own. Now we're going to dig deeper into the reporting worksheet, which is where most of the information will be entered, and all of the information used to calculate water loss is entered here. So the first of the 5 data categories that you have to put into the audit is water supplied to your system. So this is where we're going to put in the volume from our own sources, the water we import, and the water we export. And after we provide this information, it'll be able to calculate the water we supply to our customers. We also have to put in any errors that have occurred in our master meters. So we only get to put in one error. So if you have multiple meters, so let's say you have 3 or 4 sources of water and each of those sources is metered, you have to calculate a flow weighted average value and either put a percent error or an actual value error in there, and to calculate out these master meter errors. And you need to do that for both, or for all 3 of these if you have them: the volume of own sources, import, and exported. If you don't have one of these, obviously you don't have to put in an error, but any time you enter a value here, you really want to put your error. If you don't know what it is, you're going to have to make your best guess and then work towards improving that value in the future. Next, we want to supply water to our customers. So this is where we're going to put in the water that we bill and meter, the water that we bill but don't meter. These would be people who have a flat rate because we're not measuring how much water goes to their to that connection. Water that we meter but we don't bill. So this might be City Hall, this might be your water utility office, anybody for whom the water is metered but you're not sending a bill. And then our final category is unbilled, unmetered usage. There is a default value for this, but you can also enter your own value, which is, what we recommend over time is that you track this water and enter your own value. And this would be water like flushing, firefighting, things that are typically not measured, but are very important functions of your utility. Next, we have some other information. We have the theft or unauthorized consumption. There is a default value for this. And many systems don't really have much information about theft and choose to use the default. Over time, you can kind of try to estimate how much theft is occurring and use something other than the default. There are also customer meter inaccuracies that you put in here. You can only put in one value, so the percent overall. And again, it would be a flow weighted average based on the meters and all the meters in your system. And then a systematic data handling error. So within your system and all of the billing and data collection you do for metering for your customers, there could be data handling errors. There's a default for this, or you may use your own value. Then we have system characteristics. This is where we put in length of main, number of active and inactive service connections, whether the meters are located at the property boundary or not, and then average operating pressure. And finally, we have financial information. And here's where we'll put the total cost of operating the water utility, the customer retail unit cost. This is the cost we charge our customers for all the water they buy. And this is based on your rates, and it will include both the rates for the water utility, and if you bill for wastewater based on the water usage, it will also include a wastewater rate. And then that's the rate at which we cost out any apparent losses. And then the variable production cost is how much it costs you to produce the water. That's the cost we apply to real losses. And that's $1, excuse me, $1 per million gallons. And just as a final reminder, don't forget to use the comments page. It's very important to write in there what you did, how you did it, assumptions you made, where the data came from, who gave it to you, anything at all that would help somebody in looking at your water audit and trying to determine what you did. And now I'm going to turn it over to James, who's going to talk about the data grade and how that process works.
Thank you, Heather. Now that we've talked a little bit about the data and the software, let's do a quick review of the data grading aspects of the water audit software and talk about some of the tools that we'll be making available to you to help you with the data grading process. I'm going to start with three main points. The first is that each data point has its own data grading criteria. Those criteria are based on utility policies, practices, and procedures that can impact the accuracy of the data point in question. What that means is that even though each data point is graded on a 1 to 10 scale, each one has to be graded individually. You can't just grade the first data point and then apply that grade across the board. You have to evaluate each data point separately, and you don't get a 10 just because you think you're doing a great job. You have to match the listed criteria for each data point to your system's actual policies, procedures, and practices. So for example, the data grade for billed metered authorized consumption is related to whether your customers receive volume-based billing, your meter reading practices, your meter records data handling practices, and your meter replacement practices. And these criteria, of course, make sense for that data point. But other data points are going to have very different criteria. So you have to look at each one of these individually. My second point is that system policy, practice, and procedural changes can change your audit data grades from year to year, and by extension, your overall data validity score. So the fact that your system had an 80 last year doesn't necessarily mean that you can just carry the grades forward this year. Your score might be the same, but it might be better or worse depending on what you actually did last year and how your policies and practices and procedures may have changed. So for example, if your prior year's audit data grades for volume from own sources were based on an annual source meter testing regime and you skipped that testing last year for whatever reason, when you grade your volume from own sources data point in last year's audit, you have to review and adjust to reflect what actually happened during that audit year. The good thing is that you can use the grading process as a chance to review your policies, practices, and procedures to make sure that your employees are doing what you think they are. And you can use these individual criteria as a guide for improvements on how you do things at your system, either to increase your data grades or your operational efficiency. But it is important to remember that while those two things are related, they are not exactly the same, which leads to my last data point, and that is that data grading is a qualitative exercise, not a quantitative exercise. It's an assessment and evaluation of your system's policies, practices, and procedures, looking for policies, practices, and procedures that are likely to produce good data. But the data validity score is a proxy for accuracy. It is not a direct measurement of accuracy. So while a high score is generally better and indicates that your system's policies, practices, and procedures are likely to produce more accurate data, it's not necessarily so, and the criteria themselves are not perfect. There isn't a direct correlation between the data grading and the accuracy of the audit. So what I mean by this is just because you got an 85 data validity score doesn't mean that you can say your results are accurate within a specific margin of error. There are some statistical tools that you can use to develop an accuracy estimate like that we'll talk about during the program, but they are separate from the audit itself. So the grading is qualitative, not quantitative, but it is still very useful. So now that we've talked a little bit about the background, let's move on to the mechanics of data grading in the audit. Each of the data grades is located to the immediate left of the data point that it is grading. There are 20 in total, but most systems won't use all of them. So for example, if you don't export water, you're not going to have data for that field and you won't be entering a data grade, or you can simply use the NA not applicable option. Next question is, well, how do I figure out which criteria I'm supposed to use? You can hover your mouse over the red triangle in the corner of each of those data points, and the criteria will show up in a pop-up box. This format is a little hard to use. The fonts are all small and the colors are different, and there's a lot of information in there, but this is one way to get to it. And the way this basically works is you start at 1 and work your way down. Read the criteria that are listed and see whether you meet or exceed all of those criteria. If you do, you can move on to the next grade and do the next evaluation. So for example, if you were a system that had 50% of your water sources metered and you didn't do annual meter testing, you would look at this first criteria. 25% is less than 50, so you exceed that criteria. If you don't do regular meter testing, you meet the other criteria for accuracy testing and calibration. So you could say I meet or exceed all of the criteria in one and move on to grade number 2. But as I said, this is a little bit difficult to use. The format is not perfect. So the EFC has created a paper-based tool that you can use for this. And we will provide these during the training program. And this is essentially the exact same information that is laid out in the audit in a more easy to use format. We also have a third option, which is an Excel-based tool, which essentially has the questions on the left-hand side and the answers are on pull-down menus. And you basically just go through the questions and pick the most appropriate answer, and it gives you a grade based on your answers. I like this question and answer approach a little bit better because it lets you evaluate each of the criteria separately. And the AWWA has actually adopted a similar approach in the latest release of the water audit software. Once you've graded all of your data points, you will get a data validity score. It shows up at the bottom of the audit. If you have missed a data grade, it will notify you in the same place that you missed one of the data points. It will tell you how many parameters you still need to grade. It won't tell you which ones, but they're all on the same page, so it's not very hard to find the culprit. The next question we often get is, well, what is my response to low scores? What should that be? If you get a lowish score, is it good enough to take action on? And if so, what kind of action? The basic rule of thumb is anything under 50 indicates that you should probably prioritize improving your data. The software will give you some direction on how you can go about doing that. In the bottom left-hand corner, it will provide you with the top 3 categories for increasing your data validity score. There's also a grading matrix on a separate tab that provides specific action items that you can use to increase your data grade for each of the data points that you have data for. They will be highlighted in yellow. So for example, here in the middle of the page, you see the yellow highlighted box that lays out the criteria for qualifying for a grade of 6 for volume from own sources. It's important to note that these are not requirements, and they're not placed in any specific order, and they're not unique or tailored specifically for your system. Anyone with a grade of 4 or 5 is going to have the same list of action items. They are suggestions that you can take in any order that you like. So just because they're laid out in a specific order doesn't mean you have to start at the top and work your way down. These are suggestions, and it's up to you to decide which are most important for you to implement. The audit provides a number of outcomes that fall into 3 basic categories, which we call the 3 V's. The first is a volume of water in each category. The second is the value of that water based on the economics of your system, including your cost of operations and the variable production cost of water in your system. And finally, you get this qualitatively assessed validity of the audit, which is based on the individual data grades that are assigned to each data point during the audit. You'll also get a water balance. This is essentially a sort of semi-graphical layout of the volumes of water in each category. The numbers in red are non-revenue water. And as you can see, this is sort of laid out from left to right, like the audit is from top to bottom, starting with the inputs and ending with whether the water in each category generates revenue or does not. There's also a dashboard which provides a graphical representation of the water balance, moving from left to right, again, with the water supplied to your system on the left-hand side and whether that water generates revenue on the right-hand side. These obviously will look different for every system. Also, as part of the dashboard, are provided 2 graphs, one of volumes of water in each of these non-revenue categories and one with values. The important thing to look at here is that each of these graphs represents the same volume of water. So if you look, for example, on the left-hand side at the purple column in the middle, that is a volume of water associated with customer metering inaccuracies. If you look at the same table on the right-hand side, you will see that that column is much bigger because it is looking at the value of the water that is being lost. And finally, there are a list of performance indicators that the audit will generate for you. These relate to loss volumes and values. There's some financial indicators looking at non-revenue water as a percent of supplied volume and as a percent of operating costs, and some other operating efficiency indicators. Real and apparent losses and the financial indicators will be calculated for all systems. The real loss operational efficiency metrics that are shown down here are based on system size and density. If you're large enough, your real losses will be normalized by service connection. If you are a less dense system, have fewer than 32 connections per mile, your real losses will be normalized by mile of main. As part of this program, you will get access to a variety of tools and resources that we've collected in our water loss audit switchboard, which you can access through our website. And as we go through this program, we'll be pointing you to different resources that are on the switchboard that may be of use to you. And with that, we'll leave you with our contact information. We thank you for listening, and we look forward to working with you in this training program and hope that you find it beneficial.